And good morning, everybody. It's Friday. Glad you are here. My name is Bryan Armentrout with the Food Leadership Group. Here again with my esteemed colleague and friend, Jose Sabal from Sabal Food Safety Consulting. How are you, my friend? How's your Friday?
Oh my goodness. Better, it's impossible, Bryan. I have no clue what happened this year, but it's one thing better than the next one. Well, sorry, one thing better than the previous one.
Beautiful. Gotta love that. Most of this week I was out in the San Francisco Bay Area, and yesterday it was in the mid 80s out there yesterday. And then I came back to Colorado last night, 50s and windy. And I'm like, I see why Californians, when they travel to different climates like that they're all in their parkas and things, because normally for me, I'd be like, 50, this is wonderful, right? But I definitely noticed it.
Yeah.
So that was interesting. So everybody, so if you are joining the Food Safety Chat for the first time, welcome. We're really glad you're here. What you're going to find with this is every week we talk a different food safety topic, and I bring in a different expert who can help us understand those topics, because food safety is a collaborative effort. It's just not one individual working in a company. We're all in this together, right? Because whatever happens in one business impacts other businesses as well. So we have to work together and learn from these things. So for example, on the business side of things, as of a few weeks ago, did I know that sunflower oils and lecithins and even some gold colorings and things like this come from Ukraine? No, I didn't know that. Is that impacting supply chains for my clients? Oh yeah, right. So they're having to scramble to meet those supplies and react, right? And it's always better to have a plan in place to understand these type of things. Yeah. So part of our conversation here today is not a piece of Jose and I talking to you and just delivering information on PowerPoints and whatever. This is meant to be collaborative in the spirit of what I just talked about. So Jose and I pay very close attention, and you'll notice that Renee is on here as well, my assistant. Good morning.
Good morning, Renee. Well, maybe for Renee, it's good afternoon or
good afternoon for him. Yeah. So I've kind of gotten in the habit of, for international things, just saying, well, good day. All right.
Good day.
So that always seems to cover all bases. So part of this, right, is answering your questions and things that you may like to know more about. And of course, our emails are on here. Reach out to us. We love to hear from you. We love to answer your questions. So Mario, good morning. I think our message is directed to Jose there. Do you know Mario?
Yeah, I know. Yeah. Hola, Mario.
So one of the things that we do, and Jose knows me well enough that I always jump this step, right?
Oh, yes.
So part of what we want to do, so David, please join us as well, is we like to have a drink together here to celebrate the day. So join us, please. And it's not complete till you make that noise. There we go. So it's always a good way to start. So really, as Jose and I were preparing for this and thinking about what's a good piece of information to bring to everybody to talk about, is standards and regulations and all these type of things, because as we know, GFSI just took place in lovely Barcelona. I wish I could have been there. And I was very happy to see, Jose, pictures of the conference. Lots of people. So yes, things are coming back. So that's very good. Because food safety, that's where food safety gets better, right? Is when all these different people get together and they talk about these things and say, well, here's what I'm seeing in my business. What are you seeing? And figuring these things out.
Yeah. Yep. And by the way, Bryan, one of the topics, now that you mentioned that, I'm just going to comment on this. But most likely in the future, we may have a conversation about it.
Yep, absolutely.
ESG.
Sorry?
In sustainability, that was significant part of the conversation in GFSI. I won't be surprised if in very short amount of time, this is going to be part of the code. So environmental, social, and governance, ESG, that's the initials for that. I won't be surprised.
Yeah.
Well,
and that's the important thing with food safety, right? It's never static. If you're not keeping up on what's going on and what's coming, you're going to find yourself in a very uncomfortable position very quickly.
Yes. Yep.
So kind of with the theme on that, we kind of wanted to look at something, and really, Jose, I think something that's underutilized. And you're an expert in this area, so I'm really glad to be able to talk with you on this. And that's Codex. So the Codex Alimentarius. And, in the food industry here in the US, we're kind of insulated, right? We have FDA and USDA and all these standards, and we think, okay, that's good enough. But there are international standards.
Yeah.
There's ISO and these standards around Codex. And really, I was like, okay, well, what is Codex and what am I missing out on here? So I was very surprised when I really started digging down into the information, just on how much is out there. And we'll put the link in there to the site and we'll look at that, because there's a ton to learn. So I think part of this too is this process of how things work, right? So as kind of a base, and good morning, Martin, good to see you, my friend. Part of this, right, is establishing a base, right? And as we were talking about here before we got on the air was, you're going to have a hard time going somewhere if you don't know where you've been, right? You need to understand that map. So we have to understand the history. And here in the US, we're familiar with, food safety programs that were developed because of the space program and things like that. And this is where this really started. And the Codex goes all the way back to 1963. And within a country, how do things happen, right? So in the US, laws are passed, Congress passes a law. And that law is vague, right? It doesn't give specifics. It says, we want FDA to regulate this, and that.
It's a policy, Bryan.
Exactly. It's a policy.
It's just general guidance.
Yeah, well, that's a great way to put it.
Yeah. And
we're seeing this happening in real time right now with the infant formula issue that's going on here in the US with the contaminated milk powder, the infant formula with the salmonella and the Coronabacter. And Congress is, working on, okay, what do we need to do to strengthen these laws around infant formula, because something happened and we're not happy about it. So politically they're acting. So the last big thing we saw around this, of course, was the Food Safety Modernization Act, right? Huge revamp. So Congress passes a law, the president signs it, and then they hand it to FDA, USDA, and these agencies and go, okay, have fun. Yep. And then FDA has to figure out, oh, geez, how do we enforce what they want us to do? So then what they do is they write the regulations. So when people say, okay, 21 CFR 117, Code of Federal Regulations, not laws, regulations. So then FDA has a legal mechanism that they need to go through. Drafting guidance, possibly going out for public comment, definitely. Holding working groups. Sometimes if it's a huge thing, they'll have public meetings like they did with FSMA. And then those
asking for comments.
Yep, absolutely. And then they will take that information and then create regulations. So for example, they updated the good manufacturing practices at that time. And as part of that, then you have the next level, which is third party, right? So kind of what we're talking about with like the Global Food Safety Initiative, which then takes that information and creates standards which accreditation bodies will manage, and accrediting bodies like auditing companies will then create their own standards, right? So standards are the next level for auditing, right? So there's this giant behind the scenes things that are taking place. And with Codex, and there was really two main things that they came together with Codex, is they looked at the world and said, wow, international trade is really going to be big.
It's huge.
And they were right. And they said at the UN, we need to create an agency that's going to manage this. So we need to put out recommendations. So the Codex was created, and the Food and Ag Commission and the World Health Organization, right? So WHO and a group within the UN came together to create this. And they said, let's start putting together some standards. And their focus was food safety and fair trade, right?
Yes.
So exactly what FSMA updated, right? Food safety and FSVP, right? Same type of things, right? So Jose, it's always really helpful for me to, we're all back, right? All the time. Why are we doing these things?
Yep.
And if you're going to have a successful food safety program, you need to understand how it works and how to, and this is something I always try to teach my clients, is the documentation is not enough. You have to be able to explain why you do what you do and why you don't do other things, right? So having those conversations is extremely important with whoever's coming to view your programs. be it SQF auditors or state agencies or FDA or whoever, right? And these programs all work together. They aren't independent, right? So within Codex, then, right, they have all these experts that come together on these committees and create standards. And it is staggering the number of standards that are available.
Amazing.
On their website. And guess what, guys? They're free. You can go
for free
and look at these standards, and they have guidance. So if you are making canned peas, guidance on canned peas. What should you be looking at? Fascinating information. So I will put in here the link to the page for the Codex, right? So at the FAO, so the Food and Ag Commission, right? So as we know now, that's part of the UN group that publishes this. So they also look at special issues, right? So they're looking at, there was a listing here of 7 different things as well that kind of subcategorize around this. So there was animal feed, antimicrobial resistance, biotech, right? So GMO, contaminants, nutrition and labeling, pesticides, and then of course, well, we're talking about food safety.
Yep. And by the way, Bryan, something quite unique. And I don't know, since the fact that, and I'm going to give you a random example, the fact that a boiled egg, ready to eat producer and I'm going to say Ukraine, may have salmonella because the products are ready to eat, exposed to the environment before packaging, and they're working in a wet environment. Well, any boiled eggs, ready to eat facility anywhere in the world will need to identify listeria as an environmental monitoring. So this is not something that is dedicated to the United States. So that's why all of these last years I have been working understanding international laws and regulation, guidance, standards, and so on. And I have been working a lot in understanding US and European, and then regulation that is used internationally.
Right. Yeah. And so you'll hear the word harmonization a lot of times, right? So a big piece of that to help facilitate trade is understanding in that ready to eat hard-boiled egg that those things are being addressed, right? The last thing you want to do in a company is to be sourcing those eggs and going to Ukraine or whoever and having to re-educate them and teach them and essentially redo their whole business, right? Because now you can't buy from them because they're like, oh, really? Listeria is a risk in that? Oh, what's listeria, right? Now you're like, okay, now we have some problems, right? The other piece of this, which is very important, is which we always have to understand, is that there's a political side, right? There's always a political side to things. And that's why the fair trade piece is so prominent as well. There's been a lot of fighting back and forth between like the US and EU, for example, around GMO standards. So the EU very strict on GMO. The US, a completely different viewpoint. And so trying to align those type of things. And there has been more than one accusation back and forth relative to trade. And so the US would petition the World Trade Organization and say, hey, listen, what the EU is doing with these GMO standards is not fair. There's food safety, blah, blah, blah. But the business side is because of their regulations, they're closing their market to us. And that's not fair. That's not a good practice for business. And so they'll petition for those. One of the things that FDA encountered early on when they were creating the regulations for foreign supplier verification is that they wanted much stricter standards for foreign countries for compliance than US. And the World Trade Organization said, no, you can't do that. You are creating a trade barrier. Right? So those are little interesting things behind the scenes that impact all of this, which guess what? Impact us every single day, right? So you have to know these things. See, Austin had a question. This is a good one. So does Codex have auditing like GFSI?
I answered that. So, and the answer is no. Codex is just guidance.
Right. And we'll take that the next step. Does GFSI audit?
No. GFSI publishes benchmarking requirements for the food standards of the world, the food schemes. So the food schemes are going to be benchmarked against that. And then they may or may not get approved to become an international standard.
Right. So for example, Austin, if Jose and I wanted to create a new standard, we could, right? We could look at the GFSI standards and say, okay, we're going to create the Bryan and Jose food safety standard. And we could create our own set of requirements and compliance to be certified to that standard. Now, if it benchmarks to GFSI, theoretically, we could then take that to GFSI and say, hey, listen, we've created this food safety standard based upon your rules. We would like to be benchmarked to your standard for compliance to that standard. And they can do that.
Yep.
And then we could go out and audit and say, we have a GFSI standard. Would you like to be audited to that from our company, right? But it's Jose and I, our company, that's doing the auditing, not GFSI or anyone else.
Yes.
Now, it's a little more complicated than that with ISO requirements around what a certification body needs to do, around 17020 and 21. So yeah, that's some headaches there, because if you need to be accredited to be a GFSI standard, which means someone needs to come and audit Jose and I for compliance to that standard, right? So you can see how this gets very crazy very quick.
Yeah. In an effort to prevent bias.
Yes. Yeah. And it's everything that they're trying to do is to benchmark around the world, a huge task, right? All the different ways of doing things and different cultures and all these type of things to reach a standardized version of food safety, right? Not easy at all.
And you know what, Bryan? Look at this. Can you get a certificate from the FDA indicating that you have a system that is in compliance with the FDA? No. And guess what? I mean, this year, just since January, I have been intensively working with 3 companies. One is FSSC, the other one is BRC, and the other one is SQF.
Mm-hmm.
So I've been reading those codes lately a lot. And guess what? In the BRC, there is a section at the beginning that indicates that the following BRC is going to help people to be in compliance with the laws and regulations applicable to them. That is exactly the scope of these food safety systems.
Interesting. Very interesting.
And you know why? Because let's say that I want to set up a cookie company here in Florida. Okay. Can I just, rent a building and then start setting up everything and get an SQF audit and I'm done? No. I need to register with the FDA, because not being registered is a prohibited act in the law.
Yeah.
So is it possible that I may get SQF and I get 100 in an audit and then the FDA comes and shuts me down? Yes. Why?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because we have the law first and then the certification.
Right. And we hear this question a lot when you go to conferences, right? So a person will stand up in the crowd and say, yes, SQF people, I have a question. If I'm compliant to SQF, does that mean I'm compliant to FDA? No. It's close. Right. You're 95% there, but it is not.
And we're saying 95. Bryan, maybe 92, maybe 97, maybe 70. I don't know. But whatever it is, it's not exactly the same. And anyone that is in full compliance with whatever GFSI standard, they are not in compliance with the requirements of the FDA. Mm-hmm. That's a fact.
Yep, absolutely. And even within, so FDA regulations, you have to figure out which area you fall under, right? So if you're making low acid canned foods or juice, right, there's special regulations under those. And to your point on FDA, right, not certifying, the closest you will ever get to FDA saying that they approve of something would be in like aseptic, where you have to file your plan, right, your process authority control measures as part of that regulation.
Yes.
FDA will then issue a letter, and the letter it says non-objection, right?
There you go.
It doesn't say we like this and we condone it. All they're saying is we found nothing in it that we object to.
There you go.
And that's the closest you'll ever get.
Yep. 21 CFR 113, food canning establishment, and the filing of a scheduled process. That's exactly what you're talking about.
Exactly. And right, FDA, I'd understand from FDA's position, why would they want to do that, right? So let's say a food company has been endorsed by FDA theoretically. and they have a food safety issue. Right now, the food company is going to say, well, it's not our fault. This is what FDA told us to do. It's FDA's fault. Right? No, right? FDA doesn't run the company. You do.
No. And you know what, Bryan? Not only that, look at this. How all of the regulations start. The human food, the animal food, the seafood HACCP, the juice HACCP, the even the product safety rule, all of the rules. What is the intent there? Well, the intent may or may not be written in the regulation, which it is, by the way. In 507.1, the animal food, it says that everything that is written and all the criteria and definitions in the regulation are there because we need to do whatever it takes to prevent adulteration. Mm-hmm. That is the goal. Now, if the FDA provides some, requirements in the guidance document and you follow that to the T and you still miss something, the FDA is going after you because at the end, all of those things are just minimum requirements. The FDA is saying throughout the regulation, guys, if you see that there is something that could potentially adulterate your product and adulterate your product with a hazard that may cause illness or injury, it is your responsibility to control that. Yep. And if you see something that potentially may make your product unfit for food, which is another way that your product could be adulterated, well, you need to do something to prevent that from happening.
Yeah, absolutely. So here's another example that popped in my head, right? So under FSMA, you're required to have a preventive control qualified individual responsible for the food safety plan. You can either take training that's been created under the kind of a joint venture through the FSPCA or Preventive Control Alliance, or you can self-qualify, right? FDA says, okay, that's fine. If you can show us you have the credentials, that's fine too. I never recommend that. And I don't know anybody who does recommend that, right? You should take the course. But the point is, FDA is not saying that, oh, okay, you're good now and we certify you as a good PCQI. No, right? You're still responsible for putting together a good plan with good monitoring, verification, validation, all these type of proofs. So you may be the PCQI and you could be a good one or you can be a bad one. Right. So it's not a judgment saying, oh, yes, we give you our blessing and everything is good. Nope.
And to your point, Bryan, and I'm going to say as an example, in the SQF code, the SQF practitioners are supposed to take a HACCP-based training, which, by the way, I mean, we're going to talk a little bit more about this. It's any training on food safety based on the 7 principles, that's HACCP-based, okay? And then you need to be knowledgeable about the SQF code. Now, is that something that is going to be just because, and this happened to me during audits, I received, I arrived to an audit, that person showed me that she, in this case was a she took the class, she passed the exam, and when we were going through the audit, I saw evidence that she was not knowledgeable about the code, and I raised a non-conforming against the SQF practitioner. Same thing for the PCQI.
Yeah.
You're supposed to be taking the class. Is the FDA going to ask you, hey, can you please show me your certificate? Nope, you're not going to do this. But you're going to make an assessment on all of the components of the food safety plan to see if that plan was developed by someone that is knowledgeable about the requirements.
Yep, absolutely. And so within that, right, so Codex created a really good document that's going to look familiar to it when you look it up, which is the Principles of Food Hygiene, right? That was created in 1963, right? And it's been updated several times since that point in time. And when you go through that, right, that's HACCP when you look at it, right?
Yep. Okay, so look at this. This is what I found. So for you, Bryan, and for everybody that is hearing, how this concern started is because in a conference 3-4 years ago, I heard that if someone takes the preventive control for human food or animal food class, that does not count as a HACCP training. And I was shocked at that time because FSMA was already in place.
Yeah.
Okay. So last year, during the virtual FSPCA FDA annual conference, we were informed that FSPCA is currently working in making little adjustments to the class, update the class, and so on. And part of that was because they're trying to align the regulation with the GFSI requirements. And I said, oh my goodness, what I'm hearing here. Because let me tell you one thing. Originally, before NASA used the HACCP approach for manufacturing food, we do not have anything in food. But that doesn't mean that in systems, there are risk assessment techniques that we can use in order to determine the things that we do not want in our process, and taking care of those things in order to make sure that our product will always be in compliance with its own specifications. Okay? So what happened? Well, that was an engineering thing. So when the Army joined NASA in Pillsbury in this venture for sending people to space, they say, well, guys, I don't know you, but what we use the failure mode effect analysis. Oh my goodness, you grab the failure mode effect analysis, you put it right next to HACCP, and I can tell you, well, it's not copy and paste, but you can see the intent there.
Yeah.
So basically, HACCP was born out of the failure mode effect analysis. Can I give you evidence of this? No, I have not found anything. But if you compare those two techniques, you can tell exactly the same thing that I'm saying right now. So putting this into perspective, like you mentioned, looking at the forest and not looking at the individual trees, HACCP is a risk assessment technique. It's not a system. You need to set up a system and then use a risk assessment technique to determine how things may impact the effectiveness of your process in order to continuously produce exactly always the same product under the same characteristics, the same specification, the same component, everything exactly the same. Consistency is the word there for systems.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, right, relative to the evolution of the different standards and things like this, we see these type of kind of these serendipitous things happen all the time, right? So the knowledge is correct at a certain point in time for certain things to develop, right? So cars, poof, all of a sudden, right, you've got Ford and you've got Mercedes-Benz, these different people who are coming up with the ideas at about the same point in time. Right.
Yes.
And then you get this back and forth of, well, who actually thought of the idea? Well, they both did. Right. So independent thinkers who are evaluating things will often come to the same conclusion around the same time. Right. So they were all looking at these type of things and saying, well, geez, as the world opens up and things change, we need to understand these things. Right. And we need to be able to trust what's happening. We need to standardize. And this process is continuous, right? And this is exactly what we're talking about, right? Codex, ISO was mentioned in the comments, regulations, all these different type of standards, right? Everybody's driving toward creating the common framework, which is really, really hard.
So look at this, Brian. So because of that, you go to the ISO 31010 and you look in B.4.3 and you're going to find that the hazard analysis and critical control points is a risk assessment technique, not a system, and it's there. In that same document, you may find the failure mode effect analysis because it's another risk assessment technique. Okay?
Right.
So that's number one. Number two, if you go to the GFSI benchmarking requirements, and yes, remember that GFSI organizes the production of product according to different categories. It doesn't matter because whenever you go to the HACCP section, and I read this yesterday, and that's my notes here. I was looking into C3, 3 in Roman numbers, and that is for the production of perishable animal and plant products. And over there in HACCP 1.1.2, that is titled Hazard and Risk Management Systems, it says, and this is textually, I'm just going to read from what is there. This shall be a HACCP system based on the annex of the Codex Alimentarius General Principles of Food Hygiene, on the annex of the General Principle. So if you go to this document, the Codex Alimentarius General Principle of Food Hygiene, that document is divided in 2 chapters. Chapter number 1 is for the good handling practices, the GNPs for us in the United States. And then chapter number 2 is how to use the 12 steps of the Codex. And then there is one annex number 1. And annex number 1 has a summary, a graphical representation on which are the different steps that are used when implementing HACCP.
And gee, let me see. Would that be, I don't know, 7 kind of principles, maybe?
Oh, yes.
Isn't that interesting?
Yes. But if you look at the annex only contains the 7 principles, not the 12 steps.
Interesting.
There you go. So let's start comparing things and making sure that we're understanding what is the original reference for any standard, because BRC and SQF and FSSC and IFS and so on, they can only do as required by the benchmark requirements of the GFSI. So you cannot have, for example, I'm going to say BRC saying, no, guys, from now on, we are going to use the requirements in the ISO 31010 for the HACCP approach. They don't say that. They are saying you need to go to annex number 1 of the Codex Alimentarius Commission, the General Principles of Food Hygiene, annex 1. Only the 7 principles, not the 12 steps.
Yeah. And a lot of times it's very important, right? Which is why Jose and I wanted to talk about this today, right? So if you're a quality manager, you're working in a production facility that's certified to a GFSI standard, and you're there and you're trying to put together quality systems and understand all of this, you need this context to get that kind of that big picture.
Yes, because otherwise, Bryan, your system is not going to be effective.
Right.
Okay. If you go to look at this, according to that comment that, oh my goodness, the regulation, the preventive control regulation is not aligned with GFSI. And I got to say, hold on. Okay. When you go to 117.135, the preventive controls, what is there? Oh, there is saying that according to the outcome of your hazard analysis in 117.130, if I'm not wrong, according to your hazard analysis, whenever you identified a hazard that requires a preventive control, which is exactly equivalent to a significant hazard in HACCP, well, you need to set up a preventive control. Okay, so what is a preventive control? Well, it's something that has the management components. And yes, they're not saying, oh, you need to use the 7 principles of HACCP. Now, let's read what is there for the management components.
Okay.
Monitoring, principle number 4. I don't need someone to tell me, oh, this is principle number 4. Just by looking at what is monitoring, the definition of monitoring, compare the definitions. You compare the definition in Codex, compare the definition in BRC and SQF with the definition of monitoring, the regulation, and they're exactly the same. So do you really need that to be called principle number 4? No. Look at the forest, not at the trees.
Exactly.
So same thing, you have monitoring, you have corrective actions. There is a very nice explanation about what is a correction and what is a corrective action now in the new regulation, which was not part of HACCP, by the way. You go to HACCP and go to the definition of a corrective action in HACCP, and it says actions that you take whenever a deviation happens. Well, I can say I'm going to fix this and that's it, but I'm not going to do anything to prevent the reoccurrence of that problem, which is the actual definition of a corrective action. Okay, so the regulation is not the same. In this case, the regulation goes above the minimum requirements in HACCP.
Yeah.
And you have the verification and you have the record keeping. So do you have the 7 principles in the regulation? Of course you do.
Yeah, absolutely. And here's a little tidbit too, relative to hazard analysis and hazard assessments, is that in 2021, again, and I mentioned this quite a bit, right? The number 1 violation by far is foreign supplier verification noncompliance. But number 2, inadequate hazard analysis.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yes. And Bryan, as long as auditors and inspectors, and I don't care if they belong to the FDA or any of the voluntary benchmark standards, start getting better in their knowledge. Look at what I'm going to say. Start spending more time in going through an assessment of the real hazards that are happening at each and every facility, and not investing time, and I'm going to say investing because it's an investment, a lot of time in going around the building and opening each and every single base station to see if the base stations are clean or not inside, which is not the real responsibility of an auditor. We are going to start getting better. And you are going to see that in the future, more issues are going to be raised against hazard analysis and the effectiveness of the controls, the criteria that was used to determine what is acceptable and what is not.
Yep. And as a little tidbit here, so the link I put in here, I reposted the link for you, Rafael, is there's, as I mentioned earlier at the beginning in this live chat here today, is that there's all kinds of references within this documentation at the FAO for different type of programs and different hazards associated with those. Would that make really good reference documentation for justifications in your hazard analysis plan? Yeah.
Could help.
Yeah.
Eventually.
Right. So regulators always look for references to regulatory actions associated with why you're doing things. So the more you can reference back to, here's what FDA says, here's what Codex says, here's what ISO says, all these different things, the more that you can bring those in and say, this is why I did what I did based upon this information, the more solid your plan is going to be.
And Bryan, I'm going to stop you there for a second. Let's say that Jose is an inspector of the FDA, and I was trained FDA, whatever. If I'm auditing or I'm inspecting, the only reference that I'm going to use is the regulation or regulations applicable to that facility, according to their products and their processes. Okay, and that's it. Now, if I'm auditing someone, and I was a BRC, FSSC, and SQF auditor for around 9 years, when I'm auditing those standards, yes, I'm auditing against the code. I'm auditing against the standard. But guess what? Because it's a requirement of GFSI that each and every single company that is following any of those GFSI requirements are in full compliance with the regulations of the country of manufacture and the regulation of the country of sale.
Yes.
I should be auditing that they are actually in compliance with those regulations. So a GFSI auditor has the responsibility to understand regulations in the country of manufacture and the country of sale, because it's written in the code, it's there.
Absolutely. And this is why, and this is something I teach my clients. So here's a little on the ground tip for everybody, right? Is you need to understand the frame of reference and what you're doing, right? So to Jose's point here, let's say that I'm a food manufacturing plant and I'm certified to a GFSI standard benchmarked under, let's say, SQF, right? And I am a food manufacturer and I am getting the certification for version 9, right? That is my standard. That's at the top of your pyramid of your documentation program. Everything needs to fit in the scope of that, right? And one of the things I always teach my quality managers is to open auditing meetings like this. So let's say you're the auditor, Jose, and I'll sit down. And by the way, if you're in the opening meeting with just yourself and the auditor, you're already off to a bad start, because the auditor is thinking, how dedicated to food safety culture is this company if just the quality manager is sitting here in this room? Probably not too much, right? Jose's going to start digging into that. That's a side. So I'm sitting here with Jose, and let's say I have my whole team, right? We got the maintenance manager, the plant manager, and everything else. And we sit down and we have an opening meeting. And I say to Jose, it's like, Jose, I mean, we're really, really happy to have you here in our facility here today. Last year you audited us, and we're very happy to host you again here this year. I think you're going to be extremely pleased to see the progress we've made in the last year in our programs and systems. We've worked really, really hard on this, and our home is an open book to you, and we want to show you everything that we've done. Just to be clear, we're auditing to SQF, food manufacturer, version 9 for food safety. If you have any observations or suggestions that fall outside of the standard, we would love to hear those too. What have I done? What have I done there? I have set the frame, right? Because remember, auditors are people too. And they have a wide variety of experience, right? Jose knows all kinds of things, right? And he comes in and he says, Bryan, you really should start be doing this and this and this. And why aren't you doing this? I need to understand the code as well or better than the auditor. And so if the auditor's
sure,
going outside of frame, I can then bring things back on course and say, all right, Jose, I understand what you're saying here relative to pest control, but I'm not sure where that is in the standard. Can you please point to me the language in the standard that you're referring to?
Yes.
And the auditor is going to say, oh, absolutely, this falls under 11 point. Or the auditor is going to say, oh, well, strictly this isn't in the standard, but you really should be doing this. My next response is, oh, this is a observation.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes. But you know what, Bryan? So let's grab the things the way that are written right now. If GFSI says that any scheme benchmark against GFSI is supposed to understand Annex number 1 of the Codex Alimentarius, okay, you are supposed to be using the 7 principles. And one of the things that I have in my notes, and I'm skipping a few pages, is what is the definition of a critical control point? It's a step of your process where you are going to set up control measures. Okay, do we have that same definition in the preventive controls? No. Why? Because in the preventive control regulation, what is important is that for every hazard that you identified in your system that is going to be significant, and yes, you need to set up some controls, you are going to set up preventive controls. The preventive control is principle number 4, is what are you going to do in order to reduce the risk of that hazard? But the FDA is not telling you you need to apply that at a step of the process. Okay, so that is a reason why there are process preventive control, and they are equivalent to a CCP because those are the controls that you put in your step of the process. But when you're controlling the cross-contamination of allergens, and let's say that you decide to use the scheduling as an allergen preventive control, well, that is not linked to a step of the process. So anyone that is passing a BRC, SQF, FSSC audit, of course, you're not going to pass an FDA inspection because they do not have the preventive controls related to those things to prevent cross-contact of allergens, those things related to the environment and the cleaning and sanitation, and those things related to the approval of the suppliers. They're not present.
Right. And so part of this, and I get this question quite a bit in my business, I'm sure you do as well, Jose, is do I need to write separate programs for all these different standards?
Oh, no, not at all.
Yeah, never do that.
No.
Don't do that.
No. What you need to do, and I'm going back to my engineering background, you need to develop an integrated management system. That is the name. What are you integrating? All of the different sources of requirements that you're going to have. You're going to grab all of them and you're going to integrate in all of those into one system.
Exactly. And so part of this, right, is to remember why you're doing all of this, right? You're not doing this to satisfy an auditor or a regulator who passes through your facility. You're doing this to put together a management system for your company, right? How do we make safe food and how do we do it effectively?
Right? I agree, Bryan. Yeah. But you know what? We all are doing this. And I mean, more the ones that are actually working in a food facility, not that much for us as consultants and instructors. Yeah. But you know what at the end is the goal? It's written in 117.1, it's written in 507.1, it's written in 123.1, the seafood hazard, it's written in each and every single regulation. You need to do whatever it takes to prevent the adulteration and the misbranding of the product. That's it. That's the goal. And that's what we need to focus. Because it's not about being in compliance with each and every single thing that is written. It's about understanding what is the forest about.
Yes.
And then making sure that we grow the trees to comply with that supreme requirement or the policy or something like that.
Right. Well, and I think that's a super important lesson for today's talk, right? Because part of this, right, is we're really diving down into information and history and regulations and all these type of things. And it's overwhelming, right? And if you live down in that all the time, you're the forest and the trees is a perfect analogy, right? Every now and then you need to pop back and go, okay, all right, I see where this fits. I see where this is, and then go back into the detail. Right?
Yes.
If you live in the detail or you live in the overall view, both of those are wrong. You need to live in both, but you need to understand, back to our theme, you need to understand where we've been in order to understand where we're going.
And that is the reason why, Bryan, why in all of our conversations, I'm always bringing up that a system, HACCP is not a system. HACCP is a risk assessment technique.
Mm-hmm.
In systems, your goal is consistency. And your consistency must be against what is the policy. What is the policy? The prevention of adulteration and misbranding.
Yep.
That is a policy. So the scope of your system is to look for that. How do you do that? How do you achieve that? That's your problem. And if you want to grow one tree bigger than the other one, that is your problem, not mine. Yeah. As long as you can prove me that your products are not adulterated or misbranded, you're fine.
Yep. And so one of those areas that's in between is you need to understand what we're talking about here today, the history, the regulations, the laws, how these things interact from all these different bodies. And then you have your documentation that you actually create, right? So one of the things I always teach my clients when we're building quality systems is the documents are not enough. You need to be able to understand and be able to explain why, right? So when Jose is in my plant and says, okay, Bryan, show me your compliance with GMPs. Okay, great, right? I just don't shove a document in front of him and say, there you go, right? I have to explain to him why we do the things that we do. And if you can do that, correct me if I'm wrong here, but as an auditor, Jose, if I do that, your confidence in my ability is doing this, right? It's like, okay, this person understands. This person understands not just the how, but the why of we're doing things. The example I use on this is like supplier approval and monitoring, verification, all these type of things. Super important. But people put together programs and say, okay, I'm going to audit this and do these and type of things. But those are always different, right? There's varying levels of risk. Back to your FEMA analysis, right? And I am not going to pay the same attention to my salt supplier as I'm going to pay to my non-fat dry milk supplier, right? Different risks in the context of my products. So not only is it important to explain to me, to Jose as the auditor, why we do things, I'm also going to be explaining things why I don't do other things. Right? And that's really, really important. And that gets back to this frame, right? And Jose is right. And I've learned this from you, my friend, right? Is to always go back to the two keys, misbranding and adulteration. Right?
Yes.
Everything flows from that.
Which, by the way, in the notes that I have here, according to the law, U.S. law 21, United States Code 331, prohibited acts. You know what is prohibited? Receiving adulterated ingredients and raw materials and packaging material. Working under insanitary conditions is a prohibited act. So when the FDA goes into your facility, I'm going to use an example. Let's say that I'm the FDA and I'm going to a facility, and this facility has, certain product is exposed at some point. So there is a possibility that if I don't use a hairnet, hair is going to fall into the product, and I'm not doing anything to prevent because nobody's using hairnets. What the FDA is going to say is that you guys are working under insanitary conditions. The FDA do not need to test that the products contain or not hair. They just need to see that you are not doing anything in order to prevent the inclusion of hair, which is not food by default, into the product.
Right.
So according to the prohibitions, receiving something that is adulterated is prohibited by law. Working under insanitary conditions is prohibited by law. And then shipping something that is adulterated or misbranded is also prohibited by law. That is our goal. That is the scope.
Which is why, and you see how these things flow, which is why companies, when they contract with a supplier, will have continuing guarantees, right? So what they're saying is that if in that flow of product to us, you provide us with a product that fails to meet those standards, we can go back against you for that, right? You continue the chain, because if there's a recall event, it starts, most cases at retail. And then what happens is there's a trace back that takes place to that source, and that liability carries through with that, right? So that's part of the mechanisms that companies put in place in relation to these laws and principles, right? So it's always very important to remember that. Yeah.
Going back to your statement, if you keep on reading, and I'm not going to get too deep into this because it's not applicable to our conversation, but if you keep on reading on the new version of the Codex Alimentarius, the General Principles of Food Hygiene, the food safety culture is part of that document already. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, how do they define contamination? Oh, contamination of the product is when your product is adulterated with a hazard or adulterated with something that will make the product unfit for food. Well, that matches exactly the definition of the FDA, even though that you're using a different language. Mm-hmm. But the intention is there, it's exactly the same. However, if you keep on reading that document and you go through the entire document, in that document, you are going to be using good handling practices, the GMPs for us, in order to control hazards and the prevention of some filth getting into the product. Mm-hmm. In the United States, according to the way that is written in our regulation, all of the hazards must be controlled under the HACCP plan. So what that means, what is implied there, that all the filth is going to be controlled by the GMPs. Mm-hmm. And how I'm going to support this comment, because if you go to 117, 135, the preventive controls, in C as in Charlie 6, you are going to find other controls. So the FDA defines what is a preventive control, what is an allergen preventive control, what is a sanitation preventive control, what is a supply chain preventive control, or what is a recall plan, because now if you have a hazard, your recall plan is going to be part of a preventive control. Right. And then the last one is, yes, and also other controls. And when you read the definition of other controls, is that if you go through your GMPs and you identify a hazard that is being controlled by your GMP, you will need to set up other controls. Mm-hmm. Right. What that means, hazards are only controlled in the food safety plan and not in the GMPs.
Yes. So a good example of that. So other controls, right? So FDA has said within FSMA, if you produce a ready-to-eat product, you must have environmental monitoring.
Ready to eat, exposed to the environment before packaging, and there is not going to be any other thermal processing or something in order to take care of that. Under those conditions, it is mandatory.
Right. And then so FDA's has some questions on this, right? So they've been creating guidance documents and things like this to say, okay, here's what that means, right? Here's what ready to eat means, right? But always remember, and this is a good thing to kind of bring this back up again, is that guidance from FDA is not regulation. Yep. Guidance is not regulation.
Yep.
It often becomes regulation down the road, but it's not. Right. It's so not. FDA is clarifying things that they may not have thought about when they wrote the original regulation, and rewriting the regulation is a big process. So it's like, okay, we'll have guidance relative to that for now, and we'll get feedback and go through the mechanism for updating that later on.
And a good example for that one, Brian, is going to be, let's say, I was recently talking to a client. They use honey as one of the ingredients, but the finished product is raw. So when I was explaining the hazard analysis of the ingredients, I was going through the hazard analysis of an ingredient that is ready to eat. Yes. But they were telling me, Jose, we don't need all of those preventive controls there for supply chain preventive controls because, well, yeah, we know that honey is ready to eat, but our finished product is not. And I say, if you receive that honey with any kind of hazard, that product is adulterated, and you cannot receive adulterated product. That is prohibited by law, even though that the finished product is going to be raw. So that's a good point. And that's something that people on a regular basis don't take into account when they're performing the hazard analysis of the ingredients.
Well, a big piece of that too under FSMA then is hazards that are uncontrolled you need to be made aware of.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yep.
Right. And there's definitely some hazards in honey that you need to be aware of. For sure.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, definitely. So, man, that's...
Oh my goodness! Yes, it was deep.
time is over, right?
I know.
So part of this, right, is diving down and having the opportunity to talk with an expert like Jose around these type of things is super valuable, right? you need to understand, and you need to understand the why before you can do the how. Yeah. And part of that is good training, right? And if you ever have an opportunity to take a training class with Jose, do it. As you can tell on these food safety chats, Jose knows his stuff, right? Every time I'm on these, I'm learning right alongside you, right? All of this information and everything else. If you're not learning in food safety, you're falling behind, because this stuff is changing 100% all the time.
Yep.
So also I wanted to mention here before we close out is EAS, right? So the sponsor for this food safety chat. So thank you again to EAS for sponsoring this. And if you go to their website, they have some amazing training courses, right? So EASconsultinggroup.com. And if you do /training, take you right to the training courses. If you don't see what you like, they can create a custom course for you. And if you put the code Bryan in checkout with a Y, you'll get an extra 15% off. So thank you to EAS to helping support food safety training. We can always get better, that's for sure. So lots of information. So good links in here. And again, with food safety, do you have to know all of this and memorize this on your own and be as good as Jose? No, right? That's why within the food safety plan, they reference in there, what are the reference materials? What are the sources you use to find this information? So use resources, use expert knowledge, and grow your own knowledge along the way. So,
and you know what, Bryan, just as a closing statement, if you go to the regulation says that the PCQI do not need to be an employee of the company.
True.
So what that means, that you can use a consultant. If you go to SQF or BRC or FSSC, there is a way for qualified people to help you. And the reason why some consultants are outside, like Bryan and myself, I'm going to say, is because we know what we're doing most of the time. And if we do not know, which it happens, let me tell you, I'm going to dig deep and I'm going to find whatever is the answer for that.
Yeah.
But what is a fact is that all of the SQF practitioners and HACCP coordinators and food safety team leaders and so on, you guys do not have the amount of time that is necessary to go as deep as we, which is our job.
Right.
So it is a fact. Look for help.
Yeah. You have stuff to make, right? You have food to make. You have all these things. You have other things to do, right? So don't feel like you're alone. And I know, and I'm sure you're this way too as well, Jose. If I find something where I can say I don't know, I'm happy about that. Because that means my knowledge is growing. And I may not know, but I know smart people who do know, right? So I will find that answer for you.
Yep.
And then I get better as well. So yeah, never feel like you're alone in this, and never feel like that your knowledge isn't adequate, because it is adequate. And more importantly is finding the right sources. So I think that's a perfect way to end the conversation today, right? So again,
get better.
Forest, trees, forest, trees. Don't live down in the trees. You're going to get confused. You're going to get lost. Always pop back up, look and see where you're at, and then go back down. So thank you again, Jose. Man, you are an amazing teacher. So next Friday, guys, we're back again. So same time. So Food Safety Chat is live on Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. We love to get your information. We love to get your questions here. So thank you, right? We do this for you. And the fact that you're taking time out of your busy schedule to spend an hour with us every week and get this information live is amazing. And we appreciate your commitment to food safety as well, because we're all in this together. So we will see you back here next Friday, the 15th of April. Oh, tax day's coming. Tax day's coming here in the U.S. So we will have the next topic. So 8 a.m. Mountain Time, where I live in Colorado, 10 a.m. Eastern, where Jose is back in beautiful Florida. And we will see you then for the next topic. Oh, and by the way, if you have a topic you would like us to talk about, tell us, right? You have our emails right here. Send us an email. Let us know what you would like to learn about, because that's why we're here. So we will see you then. Have a wonderful weekend, Jose. And to everyone who joined us, thank you again. And we will see you back here next week. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.